Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Classical Concerts from Quarantine. I almost said. Quarantine. It might be one of those days. Thank you very much for joining me. It's 3 p.m. in London. Bright and sunny, if slightly cooler London than the balmy weather we've had the last couple of days. We've had a pretty nice week here, topped off with, I think we'd all agree, the pinnacle of the Battersea Bake-Off knockout stages, which saw our housemate Anna narrowly, by a whisker, triumph against our birthday boy Andy on Anzac Day. It won't surprise you to know that for his backstory he received maximum points, and we feel very full of cake and very tired as well after the party which rolled into the evening. So today I've got lots of lovely music for you, all of it requests from one or other of you, and lots of it is stuff, well, some of it is stuff that I've not played before, and so it's been a really nice opportunity for me to explore some different music, and some of it's music I haven't played for absolutely ages, so it should be fun. We're going to start with a piece by the composer Erik Satie. So this is the territory that was slightly new to me. I'd heard of him but never played any of his music before. He was a composer who really started coming into its most prominence at the beginning of the 20th century and was incredibly influential for much of the much music of the 20th century. He had a quite unusual approach to the idea of classical music. He was keen to strip away the pretense and the transcendence and the intensity and profundity from classical music. So he often called his pieces very strange and abstract things that didn't have a huge amount of meaning. And indeed, as I'll talk about a bit in this piece, his first Gnossienne, he wrote lots of things in the score that were deliberately designed to take the mickey out of some of his contemporaries, most notably Claude Debussy and some of the very evocative markings he used to write in his piano pieces. So Gnossienne was a title come up with entirely by Satie. We don't know entirely its origins or indeed entirely what it means. In fact, that seems to be very much the point. In many of these works he writes without key signature and without time signature, two of the most kind of formal, necessary constructs that we normally require in classical music compositions. So just some of the markings here, I translated them myself because my French is okay, but then they made so little sense to me that I consulted my dear friend Aurélien in Paris, and he gave me some insights. I'd like to share some of those with you. So at the end, he requires you to play on the tongue, whatever that means. Apply on yourself is another marking. At the end of the thought is a moment we should be particularly interested in, apparently. And my favourite one, he asks us to play very shinily. Now, shiny has a whole degree of ideas and imageries in my mind. When I consulted Aurélien about this, the clarifying item he put in was that it should be like a glowworm. Great. Fantastic. I was playing this about 10 p.m. the other night, having a wade through it, and one of our cats was on that tree post there, entirely with his back to me, staring out of the big window into absolute nothingness and blackness of the night. And it felt like the persona of the cat, combined with the fact that I had no idea what on earth he was thinking or looking at, very much summed up the kind of enigmatic, quirky, unusual elements of this very cool music. Enjoy. we are. That was for Lyridan, wonderful friend Lyridan. Thank you so much for your friendship, recent as it's been. It's been lovely to connect with you, and thank you for your support as well. And thank you for introducing me to that piece, Nate. We're now going to come on to something, I think, if that is meant to be enigmatic and uncertain as to exactly what it's replicating in its intensity, there's something very uncompromising about the intensity of this next work, although in many ways it's just as questioning and uncertain and enigmatic. It's probably the meatiest work of today's programme, and this was put in my head to do thanks to Noah, who a good mate of mine who really enjoyed the Mozart Fantasy of 2 weeks ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago. And so I decided to well, he kind of asked if there was any other very cool Mozart like that, and there's lots. Although this one really does take some beating in terms of quite how progressive and far-reaching it is. So this is the Fantasy in C, K475, and as we spoke about last time, improvisation was very much vogue at the time, and the greatest composers were also great pianists and wonderful improvisers, and they would even have kind of battles with each other at events to sort of see who could outdo each other on the improvisatory scale. And I guess so from this was born the idea of these fantasies, these very free pieces that defy formal structure and formal harmonic relationships. And this is as far as I think anyone in the classical era went in that direction, this piece. A couple of things that I think are particularly interesting. It's Fantasy in C. Normally at this time a composer would stipulate whether we were in C major or C minor. We spoke a bit about majors and minors last week. They comprise two of the same three notes, and the middle note is slightly altered, but they are a world away, as you can hear, in terms of emotional import. So normally it'd be like, well, we're going to write in C major, a piece in C major or C minor. And to give you an example of, a famous piece he wrote in C major at not dissimilar time, this famous piano sonata. We know where we are there. So he starts in C major, he goes to a couple of other related keys, and by the end of the first kind of sentence, we're back in C major and he's said his stall out. Alternatively, he wrote a sonata in C minor just after the Fantasy that I'm going to play, and that starts like this. Again, the stall is set out. We know where we are. The home key is clearly established. It's very telling that for this Fantasy, he doesn't give us that luxury. He calls it a Fantasy in C, and right from the first bar, he throws in curveballs that surprise us. And actually the first bar, although it is unusual because of the third note, which feels very alien and uncertain and kind of questioning to us, actually the first bar is just the beginning of the madness. And the whole of the first section is this incredible journey through unbelievably different harmonies and sounds. Surprise after surprise after surprise. No formal melody that we would expect from Mozart. Just these extraordinary explosions of colour and sound. This piece is in a number of sections, some probably about 6, I think. And there's often very little transition between them, and they're always highly different. So from this naked world of stark, unified uncertainty at the beginning, with all these long silences that just leave us thinking, God, where on earth are we? We go to the second section, which is completely as we would expect from Mozart, a lovely singing tune with a simple accompaniment in the left hand. And he seems to delight throughout this work in setting the kind of music we kind of grown to expect from him against this incredibly stark, intense, driven, harmonically uncertain music. 1785 is the day of composition of this. Mozart was in his probably most purple patch as a composer, both in terms of popularity, output, and quite what extraordinary things he was doing with his music. It was all to go downhill, of course. He was to die only 6 years later in destitute poverty. But such is so often the way of someone with so much genius. There's a couple of cadenza-like passages here. I mentioned the improvisation aspect earlier. There's a couple of times where the music stops, loses all kind of form and meter, and we kind of, well, cadenza was always a section that would be improvised traditionally. These are kind of written out cadenzas, and so it just feels very, very free, as if I'm just making it up, and we kind of remain suspended in time and space before we find the next section. The only thing we can kind of hang our hat on in the whole work, it's a fairly long work, 12, 13 minutes, is that the opening section does return at the end to give us some kind of unity. And then finally, C minor is firmly established as the key at the very end, which is crucially important because he published this back to back with the sonata that follows, that I played you a little taster of, in C minor. And although he did play and perform the Fantasy separately, many people have also pointed to the fact that also due to their similar K numbers, they could very well have been intended to be performed together, with the Fantasy acting as like a slow introduction to the sonata. I think the sonata is definitely something I'd love to whip out in future weeks, so keep your eyes open for that. And those of you who know the Pathetique Sonata of Beethoven, I think there's no doubt that he was influenced strongly by this, which, by the way, that sonata is also in C minor. I think there's no doubt at all that he was strongly influenced by this idea of a slow introduction full of foreboding before the storm is fully unleashed. So, I mean, this is an extraordinary work, and this is for you, Noah, and I very much hope you'll enjoy it. Cool. Yeah, lovely. Well, I'm not sure lovely is the right word. It's weird, I always find my head is so scrambled after playing a piece like that. Normally in a concert you'd have people applauding, so I'd be able to get up, smile, bow, wait for the applause to die down, and then start talking again. Have some time to catch some kind of logical thought. But anyway, here we are. What's next? I think maybe Schumann. I think that would be better next. Yes. By the way, that last piece is on my DVD. Obviously, the lockdown has butchered all concerts and a fair amount of my teaching. If you're enjoying these concerts and would like to help out to me, I'd love it if you buy the DVD. There's a link on the description in Facebook and YouTube. If you're on Instagram, you're going to have to go to my website, but it's not very difficult. Obviously, I'm mainly doing these concerts to raise money for the NHS because they really need it at the moment. I'm not quite sure when the UK is going to properly turn the corner, but right now things are still pretty desperate. I'm so overwhelmed with your support so far. We're pushing £2,500. So like, there's a donation link on the YouTube and the Facebook again. If you'd like to, if you can afford it, then please do. That'd be lovely. So look, I've got a couple of birthdays that friends of mine who have their birthdays around this time have asked me to play certain things. The first one is for the man who's sitting in the corner of this room, Andy, one of our lovely housemates of Bake Off fame, as I'll have referenced earlier in this episode. He's been sitting in on lots of these concerts, which has been really lovely, and in a way that he's introduced me to so much from his literary background in publishing. It's really nice to be able to share with him some of what I do and the wonderful mystical, or hopefully not too mystical, world of classical music. So I was wondering what I might play for him, and I've gone for this piece by Schumann called Warum, which means why, and he even puts a question mark at the end of the title. It's the third from his set of fantasy pieces, Opus 12. And I think there's two reasons why I chose this for Andy. It's because Schumann was a very literary man, much more so than most musicians. He was the son of a bookseller, so he was brought up surrounded by storytelling and books, literature. His parents very much wanted him to go to university. In fact, he did, under pressure from them, go to university initially to study law, but very soon the call of music was too strong, and that became his life. So I think the reason, Andy's obviously is in publishing, there's a nice parallel there, but it's not just that Schumann was surrounded by books. I think he's one of the first storytellers, proper storytellers. He loved writing these little character pieces. I hope to share with you some of them in future weeks. His Kinderscenen, for example, are absolutely charming, divine works. But he was sort of the first one to write these little pieces with a headline, a title that gives you an idea of what they're about, and within a minute, 2-3 minutes, he transports you to a fantastical world. So I think that was a lovely parallel with Andy, who's got such a beautiful way with words and is such a good anecdotalist and storyteller. And the other thing is that, as typified by last night's Whiskey in the Garden, it's lovely staying up till all hours putting the world to rights with Andy, and he's a man constantly searching for meaning and more and a greater understanding of himself and the world around him. There can be no greater piece than Warum by Robert Schumann. Robert Schumann was a very unusual bloke. He suffered from bipolar disorder, and he wrote his alter egos into his pieces. He had a character called Florestan, who was the very extrovert version of himself, and an introverted character called Eusebius, who was the very introverted side of himself. This is obviously more Eusebius than Florestan. But it's really just, the piece is 5 lines long, and it's really just the way he manages to... There's no hint of this being a trivial or salon piece of music. This is a piece of real thought and philosophy. It's a terrible generalization, but unfortunately I find that it holds true in so many cases. I feel like in music very often a falling phrase one might think of as a sigh or a resolution or an answer. And a rising phrase, more often than not, always makes me think of a question. And at the end of the first phrase, which comes back a lot in this piece, we get that rising interval, and that has such a kind of eyebrow-raised, pregnant curiosity to it. It's really just unbelievably effective. He offers many solutions to that conundrum that he sets by going through lots of different keys, bringing in voices in different parts and different hands. But the piece ends as much suspended in mid-air as it begun. Marvellous. Happy birthday. Very cool piece. I remember almost exactly when I discovered that the music I was playing didn't always have to have a concrete point and a message. I know something about my personality, always wanting to find answers to things. I always had thought that when playing, I had to know exactly what every phrase meant and deliver something very concrete. And I remember very clearly the lesson with Charles Owen, my teacher at Guildhall, where he opened my eyes to the idea that a musical phrase can just be quizzical, can just be a fragment of a thought, and that still resonates with people because, of course, we're so full of uncertainty and questions ourselves. Marvellous. Okay, the next piece is a bit of Fauré, one of his nocturnes, his first nocturne in fact, opus 33. This is a request by a very dear friend of mine, but she's requested to remain anonymous, so of course I honour that. But thank you for the request, thank you for your support, and this is one of my very favourite pieces that I ever played by Fauré. It's absolutely intoxicating in terms of its sound world and its use of harmony. 5 seconds in, you just kind of want to melt. In fact, I was playing this for one of my students the other day just to awaken things, and yeah, within a few seconds we were sort of just kind of gasping and murmuring together at the extraordinary sound world that he creates at the beginning. Very simply, he just has these throbbing repeated chords underneath quite a high melody. But the music is so, I don't know how to even describe it, sort of pure but also incredibly intoxicating. So he lays down this opening section that leaves us completely spellbound. And then the second section starts with something much more real and nightmarish, I think. If we are to take the titles literally, Nocturne and Night Piece, it would make sense to be thinking along those lines. Fauré wasn't a big fan of titles. Often he said, I would like to call this piece just Piece 10. But on request of his publisher, he did put more descriptive titles than Piece 10 into his scores. So yeah, I feel like the second section, this incredible rumbling starts in the left hand. And we've previously started the piece so high, up here, the piece has gradually sunk to that register, and then when the second subject starts in that register, it really feels like a much darker beginning. This is contrasted with an unbelievable section where he writes a melody about here, and but puts a kind of echo, a halo above the melody with the left hand crossing the right hand in octaves up here. You'll see when it comes. Unbelievable. He was an organist and ambidextrous, so he writes very differently to other composers, both in the kind of patterns he uses and also in just the complete equal division of labour, if you like, he puts between the hands. So the second section is really made up of those two themes setting against each other, the nightmarish one and then the one with the crossed hands. The one with the crossed hands is this kind of utopian sort of deliverance from the nightmare that never really feels very secure, stable. This builds to a big climax and then fades back into the music of the opening. And it's the same harmonies, but the way he's using the accompaniment, he's setting up these agonizing, crunching dissonances against the harmonies on every single beat. It winds its way to the end, but not before the nightmare has returned to rear its head and remind us that it hasn't gone away, and the music sinks into very intense, deep darkness for the last few bars. Some composers and musicians have what we call synesthesia, whereby they see colours with individual chords and harmonies. It's a very intense relationship they have, whereby it's unthinkable of them that a piece in C major would sound the same as a piece in G major because of the very feeling of those chords. I confess I don't have that kind of relationship with harmony quite. although it's no coincidence this piece is in E flat minor, which is a piece with so many black notes and so many flats. It really does feel darker and more obscure than a piece with very few black notes or with very many sharps, which always feels a little bit more luminous, a little bit more open. Wonderful work, really cool. Hope you enjoy it. Notwithstanding a cat bell and a cat stride, we made it. Thank you to the door operator for letting her out before she started whinging. Okay, last piece for today is for another birthday. This is a dear friend of mine whose birthday is on Tuesday, and he wrote to me early in the week and said he'd love it if we could do this piece. This is a Chopin Mazurka in A minor, Opus 17, number 4. It's a marvellous piece for many reasons. I think when Chopin writes his Polish dances, so when he writes his mazurkas and when he writes his polonaises, I think this is where one feels that one is seeing his soul most authentically. Because of course this is where he had the greatest resonance to his home country of Poland, a country he left when he was pretty young, for innocent enough reasons, with a friend to go on a concert tour, but soon after they left Poland it was plunged into war, and his friend went back to fight and was subsequently killed in the conflict. Chopin didn't return for a long, long time. Instead continued on his journeys and eventually settled in Paris, where he made his name and lived for much of his life. So it's interesting with his music, one has this dichotomy between the elegant, chic salon music of the Parisian musical scene at the time, which was very much the epicenter of everything that was cultural and elegant and sophisticated. You've only got to listen to his waltzes to hear how adept he was at producing music of that ilk. And then you have this much more bare, stripped back, sad, nostalgic, bittersweet, personal for me anyway, music, where one feels like he is very much showing you exactly what he was feeling. And as I say, these come across most starkly for me in the mazurkas and the polonaises. There are stacks of mazurkas. They're probably less played, I think, than any of his other works. And this particular one, I can't remember how I found it, why I found it, but it just seemed to me so wonderfully to capture this essence of, undoubtedly he felt a great amount of nostalgia. He missed Poland, he loved his country, but also maybe there was an element of guilt there, feeling that he'd abandoned Poland in its time of need and maybe abandoned his friend and not gone back and fought alongside his friend. So complex emotions and the landscape, the emotional harmonic landscape of this piece just seems to so beautifully fit that. It's quite sad and melancholic, as you can imagine. It's in 3 sections, the 2 outer sections being the sad, melancholic music, and the central contrasting section, he moves into the major. And we spoke about this a bit last week, but it's almost sadder when he moves into the major, even though major is traditionally more associated with happy music, because one has a feeling that in this major central section he's remembering beautiful times spent in the past, and with the very clear knowledge that they are not the present and they are not here anymore. And the anguish and pain with which the music of the opening returns after this major section is very brutal almost, especially in a piece that so far kept its emotions relatively contained. I love playing this piece as an encore in my concerts, because very often in a big concert one finishes with a huge explosive work. And so it's very nice then if one is invited to return to play more by the audience to give them something much more pared back. And this is why I think my dear friend Martin suggested this piece, because he's a wonderful friend and a dear supporter, and he's come to so many of my concerts, and I know very well that this piece means a great deal to him. To give you an idea of Martin's level of commitment, I once had consecutive concerts in North Wales and South Cornwall on consecutive nights, and he volunteered to be my chauffeur for that sojourn. And I'll never forget those times, driving long and hard through the country and with your wonderful company. One of very many times you've put yourself out for me, and I remember them all and love you very much for them. This is for you. Happy birthday, Mitch. Oh, the beginning and the end of this work is quite unusual, because it's got a little kind of intro and outro that's the same, utterly enigmatic and not really harmonically or thematically connected to the rest. And it just kind of, it starts us off with a feeling of uncertainty and leaves us hanging and unsure as well. Interesting device. we are. Oops, easy. Another week comes to an end. Thank you so much for joining me. It's hard to put into words how much it means to be able to keep doing this. As someone who's been performing pretty much every week for the last 15 years, 16 years, it's I don't know how weird it would feel not to be able to do that for so many months. So thank you for all affording me that opportunity to share this amazing stuff with you. And tune in next week. I'll be here. Give to the NHS. Stay indoors. Avoid contact. Let's hope that when we meet again next week, the UK is starting to turn the corner a bit more decisively. All the best.